Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than most people expected a Navy SEAL to be. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a lean build, she often heard whispers about how someone her size could have possibly made it through the grueling training that broke much larger men. What people didn't see was the steel determination behind her dark eyes and the countless hours of training that had forged her into one of the military's most precise marksmen. After 8 years of service, including 3 deployments in hostile territories, Sarah had returned to civilian life in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Colorado. The transition hadn't been easy. The nightmares came regularly, and the hypervigilance that had kept her alive overseas now made simple trips to the grocery store feel like combat missions. She found herself constantly scanning for threats, noting exit routes, and positioning herself where she could see everyone who entered a room. The Veterans Affairs counselor had recommended finding a hobby that could help her readjust. Something that would give her purpose but allow her to process her experiences at her own pace. Sarah had considered several options before settling on something that felt natural: competitive shooting. It combined her military training with a peaceful, controlled environment where precision and focus were valued above everything else. The Cedar Ridge Shooting Club was housed in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building had concrete walls that muffled the sound of gunfire, and the main range featured 25 shooting lanes with electronic targets that could be positioned at various distances. The club attracted a diverse crowd: hunters preparing for the season, law enforcement officers maintaining their qualifications, and recreational shooters who enjoyed the challenge of improving their accuracy. On her first visit, Sarah had quietly signed up for a membership and spent time familiarizing herself with the range rules and safety protocols. She noticed that most of the other members were men, many of them older, and quite a few seemed to know each other well. The conversations she overheard suggested that many were military veterans themselves, though from different branches and eras of service. For the first few weeks, Sarah kept to herself. She would arrive during off-peak hours, claim a lane at the far end of the range, and methodically work through her shooting routine. Her targets consistently showed tight groupings that impressed even herself. The muscle memory was still there: the breathing techniques, the steady hand, the ability to block out everything except the sight picture and trigger control. It was during her 4th week at the club that she first encountered the group that would later become the source of considerable frustration. 3 men who seemed to consider themselves the unofficial leaders of the shooting club had noticed her exceptional scores and apparently found them suspicious. The leader of this trio was a man named Rick Patterson, a loud, heavy-set individual who claimed to have served in the Army during the Gulf War, though his stories often contained details that didn't quite add up. Patterson's 2 companions were equally boastful. Mike Henderson allegedly had been a Marine sniper, though his shooting scores suggested otherwise, and Tony Walsh claimed extensive law enforcement experience that somehow never resulted in any verifiable credentials. The 3 of them had a habit of dominating conversations in the club's common area, sharing increasingly elaborate stories of their supposed tactical experience and generally making newer members feel unwelcome. When Sarah's scores began appearing on the club's monthly competition board, consistently ranking in the top 3 positions, Patterson and his friends took notice. They began making comments just loud enough for her to hear. Remarks about how the targets must be malfunctioning, how certain ammunition types were easier to shoot accurately, and how some people might be getting special treatment from the range officers. Sarah ignored these comments initially. She had dealt with skepticism about her abilities throughout her military career and had learned that actions spoke louder than words. She continued her routine, arriving early in the morning when the range was less crowded, working through various shooting exercises, and leaving quietly without engaging in the social aspects of club membership. However, the comments escalated. Patterson began approaching other club members, suggesting that Sarah's scores were somehow fraudulent. He implied that perhaps she was shooting from shorter distances than recorded, or that someone else was doing her shooting for her. The accusations became more specific and more insulting, often carrying undertones that questioned not just her shooting ability but her right to be at the range at all. The situation reached a breaking point on a busy Saturday afternoon. Sarah had arrived later than usual due to a doctor's appointment related to her VA benefits. The range was crowded, and she had been assigned to a lane in the middle of the shooting area, surrounded by other members rather than isolated at the end as she preferred. She was working through a precision shooting exercise, firing slowly and deliberately at a target positioned at 100 yards. Each shot was carefully planned, with proper breathing and trigger control, resulting in a grouping that would have impressed her old instructors. She was completely focused on her shooting when she became aware of loud voices behind her. Patterson and his friends had positioned themselves at a table in the observation area directly behind her lane. They were making no effort to keep their voices down, clearly intending for her and everyone else in the area to hear their conversation. The comments had moved beyond simple skepticism about her abilities to personal attacks that questioned her service record, her honesty, and her character. "I'm telling you, there's no way someone that size went through SEAL training," Patterson was saying, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the range. "Especially not a woman. The whole thing is probably made up. Stolen valor, you know? Happens all the time these days." Henderson chimed in with his own theory. "Even if she did serve, which I doubt, she sure as hell wasn't anything special. Probably spent her whole deployment behind a desk somewhere safe. Now she comes here trying to impress people with these fake scores." Walsh added the final insult. "What gets me is how she acts all quiet and mysterious, like she's some kind of war hero. Meanwhile, real veterans who actually saw combat have to watch this little girl pretend she knows something about shooting." The words hit Sarah harder than she had expected. She had endured worse during her actual service, had proven herself in situations where failure meant death, had earned the respect of her teammates through actions rather than words. But something about hearing her service questioned in this environment, among people who were supposed to understand the bonds of military brotherhood, triggered a response she hadn't anticipated. Her hands began to shake slightly, not from fear or nervousness, but from a deep anger that she recognized from her combat deployments. It was the same cold fury that had helped her maintain composure during firefights, the controlled rage that made her more effective rather than reckless. She set her rifle down carefully, removed her hearing protection, and turned around to face the three men who had been talking about her. The range suddenly became quieter as other shooters noticed the confrontation developing. Sarah walked slowly toward the table where Patterson and his friends were sitting, her movements controlled and deliberate. She stopped about 6 feet away from them, close enough to speak without shouting but far enough to maintain a non-threatening posture. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about my service record and shooting ability. I'm wondering if you have specific concerns you'd like to discuss with me directly rather than sharing them with everyone else here." Patterson leaned back in his chair, a smirk spreading across his face. He had apparently been waiting for this confrontation and seemed pleased that Sarah had taken the bait. Well. The mystery woman finally decides to talk. "Yeah, we've got concerns. This is a serious shooting club for serious marksmen, not a place for people to play pretend." The other men nodded in agreement, clearly emboldened by having an audience. Several club members had stopped their own activities to watch the developing situation, some looking uncomfortable with the tension, others seeming curious about how it would resolve. Sarah kept her expression neutral, drawing on years of training in dealing with hostile situations. "I understand you have questions about my qualifications. What specifically would you like to know?" Henderson jumped into the conversation. "For starters, when and where did you supposedly serve? What was your unit? What kind of missions did you go on? Because frankly, your whole story sounds like something you read on the internet. And even if you did serve," Walsh added, "which we seriously doubt, there's no way you're shooting the scores you claim. Something fishy is going on here, and we're going to get to the bottom of it." Sarah realized that no amount of explanation would satisfy these men. They had already decided that her story was false, and they were more interested in public confrontation than genuine verification of her claims. She also recognized that this situation could easily escalate if she wasn't careful, potentially leading to her being banned from the club or worse. "I can see that you've already made up your minds," she said calmly. "However, if you're genuinely interested in verifying my abilities rather than simply questioning them, I'd be happy to demonstrate my shooting skills under whatever conditions you consider fair." Patterson's eyes lit up with interest. This was apparently exactly what he had been hoping for, a chance to publicly embarrass someone he believed to be a fraud. Now that's an interesting proposition. You're willing to put your money where your mouth is? What did you have in mind? Sarah asked, though she was already beginning to formulate her own ideas about how this demonstration might proceed. The range officer, an older man named Bill Thompson who had been watching the confrontation with growing concern, approached the group. Folks, I don't want any trouble here. This is a family-friendly establishment, and we don't tolerate harassment or hostile behavior. Patterson turned to Thompson with exaggerated innocence. No harassment here, Bill. Just a friendly discussion about shooting skills. In fact, this young lady has volunteered to demonstrate her abilities. We're thinking maybe a little informal competition, just to settle everyone's curiosity. Thompson looked uncertain. He clearly didn't want trouble, but he also recognized that telling people they couldn't shoot at a shooting club would be difficult to justify. Any competition would have to follow club rules. Safety first, proper supervision, and no gambling or inappropriate behavior. Absolutely, Sarah said. I'm suggesting a simple demonstration of marksmanship skills. Nothing more complicated than that. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Sarah could hear whispered conversations as people speculated about what was happening and what might happen next. She realized that backing down now would validate Patterson's claims and make her continued membership at the club untenable. At the same time, she needed to be careful not to let her anger drive her into a situation that could have serious consequences. Here's what I propose, she said, addressing Patterson directly. 5 shots at whatever target and distance you consider challenging. Standard club ammunition, so there's no question about equipment advantages. You can choose the conditions, and we'll let the results speak for themselves. Patterson looked at his friends, clearly pleased with how the situation was developing. 5 shots, huh? That's not much of a test. Any lucky amateur could get 5 decent shots. Then, you choose the number, Sarah replied. I'm confident in whatever challenge you think is appropriate. The range officer intervened again. If we're going to do this, it needs to be organized properly. Standard competition rules, official scoring, witnesses, the whole thing. I won't have people claiming afterward that something wasn't fair or legitimate. Sarah nodded her agreement. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. Patterson was clearly enjoying being the center of attention. All right then, little lady. You want to prove you're the real deal? Here's what we'll do. 5 shots, but not at some easy target. We'll set up at the maximum range distance, 300 yards. And, to make it interesting, we'll use the smallest target rings. If you're really as good as you claim, that shouldn't be a problem. 300 yards was indeed a challenging distance, especially with the standard ammunition available at the club. The wind conditions, lighting, and other factors would all come into play. However, Sarah had regularly engaged targets at much greater distances during her service, often under far more difficult conditions than the controlled environment of an indoor range. 300 yards works for me, she said. When would you like to do this? How about right now? Patterson replied. No point in waiting around, and everyone here can watch. Unless you need time to prepare or something. Sarah looked around at the gathered crowd, noting the mix of expressions on the faces watching her. Some people looked skeptical, clearly believing Patterson's accusations. Others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontational atmosphere. A few appeared genuinely curious to see how the situation would resolve. Right now is fine with me, she said. Let's set up the targets. The range officer, Bill Thompson, took charge of setting up the challenge. He was clearly uncomfortable with the situation but recognized that failing to handle it properly could lead to even bigger problems. He gathered the necessary equipment and began establishing the formal parameters for what was quickly becoming the most anticipated shooting demonstration in the club's history. All right, everyone, Thompson announced to the growing crowd. If we're doing this, we're going to do it right. Official range rules apply. Safety is the top priority, and anyone who interferes with the proceedings will be asked to leave immediately. Sarah watched as Thompson methodically set up the target system at the 300-yard mark. The target itself was a standard precision shooting bullseye with scoring rings clearly marked. The smallest ring, worth 10 points, was roughly the size of a silver dollar at that distance. Hitting it consistently would require not just skill, but exceptional focus and technique. Patterson and his friends were holding court with a larger group of spectators, clearly relishing the attention. Their voices carried across the range as they explained to newcomers what was happening and shared their predictions about the outcome. The general consensus among Patterson's supporters seemed to be that Sarah was about to be publicly exposed as a fraud. "I feel kind of bad for her," Mike Henderson was saying, though his tone suggested anything but sympathy. "She's gotten herself into a situation where there's no way to save face. Either she's going to shoot poorly and prove we were right about her, or she's going to make some excuse and back out." Tony Walsh nodded in agreement. "Either way, we'll finally get some peace and quiet around here. Maybe people will think twice before coming in here with fake stories about their military service." Sarah ignored the commentary and focused on her preparation. She selected her rifle, a precision bolt-action model that she had become familiar with during her weeks at the club. The weapon was well-maintained and accurate, though not quite as sophisticated as the equipment she had used during her military service. She checked the scope settings and made minor adjustments for the increased distance. Thompson approached her with a clipboard and a serious expression. "Ma'am, I need to be clear about something. This isn't an official club competition, so there won't be any prizes or formal recognition. But the scoring will be legitimate, and I'll be documenting everything properly. Are you certain you want to proceed with this?" "I'm certain," Sarah replied, checking her ammunition. "But I appreciate you making sure this is handled professionally." As she prepared her equipment, Sarah's mind wandered to her days at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility. She remembered the countless hours spent on the sniper range, working with instructors who demanded perfection not because they enjoyed being difficult, but because lives depended on that level of skill. The pressure she felt now was nothing compared to the weight of knowing that a missed shot could mean the difference between her teammates coming home or not. The range officer completed his preparations and called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin a 5-shot precision shooting demonstration at 300 yards. The participant will be using standard club ammunition and range equipment. Scoring will be based on the standard 10-ring system, with the highest possible score being 50 points. Patterson stepped forward, apparently appointed as the unofficial spokesman for the skeptics. "Before we start, I want it clearly understood that this woman has claimed to be a Navy SEAL with combat experience. She's also claimed to have earned the high scores we've seen on the monthly board. This demonstration will either validate those claims or expose them as false." Sarah felt the familiar calm that had served her well in combat situations. The external noise and pressure seemed to fade into the background as her focus narrowed to the essential elements of marksmanship. Breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, follow-through. The same fundamentals that had been drilled into her thousands of times during training. "The range is clear," Thompson announced. "Shooter, you may begin when ready." Sarah approached the firing line, her movements deliberate and confident. She positioned herself in a stable prone shooting position, adjusting her body alignment for optimal control and comfort. The rifle settled naturally into her shoulder, and she began the process of establishing her sight picture. Through the scope, the target seemed both distant and intimate. She could clearly see the concentric circles of the scoring rings, with the small center circle that represented the maximum points available. Wind flags positioned along the range showed minimal air movement, which was favorable for precision shooting. The lighting was consistent, and there were no obvious environmental factors that would complicate the shots. The first shot was always the most important in any precision shooting sequence. It established the baseline for the remaining shots and provided crucial information about how the rifle was performing under current conditions. Sarah controlled her breathing, slowly exhaling until she reached her natural respiratory pause, then gently applied pressure to the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed through the range. Even before looking through the spotting scope, Sarah could tell from the rifle's recoil and the way it settled back into position that the shot had been executed properly. The fundamentals had been solid, and the follow-through was smooth. Thompson examined the target through a high-powered spotting scope and announced the result. First shot scores 10 points. Dead center of the bullseye. A murmur went through the crowd of spectators. Hitting the center ring on the first shot at 300 yards was impressive, though not necessarily conclusive. Even Patterson and his friends seemed momentarily subdued, though they quickly recovered their skeptical attitudes. "Lucky shot," Henderson muttered, though his voice lacked some of its earlier confidence. "Let's see if she can do it again." Sarah was already preparing for the second shot. She made a minor adjustment to her position, accounting for the slight difference in her body's position relative to the first shot. The muscle memory from countless hours of training took over as she repeated the same sequence of breathing, sight alignment, and trigger control. The second shot felt even better than the first. The trigger brake was clean, and the rifle's recoil felt perfectly balanced. Through peripheral vision, she noticed that the crowd had grown quieter, with more people focusing intently on the demonstration rather than engaging in conversation. "Second shot, 10 points," Thompson announced. 2 for 2 in the center ring. The atmosphere on the range had shifted noticeably. What had started as a somewhat jovial challenge was now being taken seriously by everyone present. Even people who had been engaged in their own shooting activities had stopped to watch Sarah's demonstration. Patterson's group was no longer making loud comments about the outcome. Instead, they were watching through binoculars and consulting among themselves in hushed tones. Sarah could see uncertainty beginning to creep into their expressions as the reality of what they were witnessing began to sink in. For the third shot, Sarah took slightly longer to prepare. Not because she was feeling pressure, but because she wanted to ensure that she was maintaining the same high standard of technique that had produced the first 2 perfect shots. Consistency was the hallmark of true marksmanship skill, and she was determined to demonstrate that her abilities were not the result of luck or favorable conditions. The third shot was fired with the same precision as the previous 2. The rifle settled back into position exactly as before, and Sarah had the same confident feeling about the shot's execution. She was beginning to enter the zone that she remembered from her military days, where external distractions disappeared and the entire world narrowed down to the relationship between herself, the rifle, and the target. "Third shot, 10 points," Thompson called out. "Perfect score so far." The crowd had grown significantly larger, with people from other parts of the club arriving to witness what was clearly becoming an exceptional shooting demonstration. Word was spreading throughout the facility that something remarkable was happening on the main range. Sarah noticed that several people were taking photographs and videos with their phones, documenting the event for sharing with friends or posting on social media. She briefly wondered if this level of attention was what she wanted, then decided that the demonstration had taken on a life of its own and needed to be completed regardless of the consequences. Patterson had moved closer to the firing line, using a pair of high-powered binoculars to examine each shot as it was fired. His earlier bravado had been replaced by intense concentration as he tried to find some flaw in Sarah's technique or equipment that might explain her exceptional performance. "She's got to miss eventually," he said to Henderson, though his voice lacked conviction. "Nobody shoots 5 perfect shots at that distance. It's just not possible." Henderson nodded, but Sarah could see doubt in his expression. "Maybe she's better than we thought. But that doesn't mean all her other claims are true." Sarah prepared for the fourth shot, maintaining the same methodical approach that had served her well so far. She was aware that the pressure was building, both from the crowd's expectations and from her own desire to prove conclusively that her skills were legitimate. However, she had learned during her military service to compartmentalize that pressure and use it as motivation rather than allowing it to create anxiety. The fourth shot felt different from the previous 3. Not worse, but different. The wind had shifted slightly, requiring a minor adjustment in her aim point. She compensated for the change, applied the same fundamental techniques, and fired with confidence. "Fourth shot, 10 points," Thompson announced. 4 perfect shots. The announcement was met with scattered applause from the crowd. Sarah realized that the demonstration had evolved beyond simply proving her abilities to Patterson's group. She was now performing for the entire club membership, many of whom were accomplished shooters themselves and could appreciate the difficulty of what she was accomplishing. one shot remained. Sarah understood that regardless of how this final shot scored, she had already proven her point. 4 perfect shots at 300 yards was not the result of luck or favorable conditions. It was the product of genuine skill, extensive training, and real experience. However, she also knew that failing to complete the sequence with a 5th perfect shot would give Patterson and his supporters an opportunity to claim that her performance had been partially fraudulent. A single poor shot could undermine the impact of the 4 excellent ones that had preceded it. The preparation for the 5th shot took longer than any of the previous ones. Sarah carefully checked every aspect of her position, equipment, and technique. She noted the wind conditions, lighting, and any other factors that might influence the shot's outcome. Most importantly, she focused on maintaining the same mental state that had produced the 4 perfect shots. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the normal background noise of the range had diminished as other activities paused in anticipation of the final shot. Sarah could feel dozens of pairs of eyes watching her every movement, waiting to see how the demonstration would conclude. She settled into her final sight picture, controlled her breathing, and began the trigger press that would complete the sequence. The rifle fired with the same crisp report as the previous 4 shots, and she followed through with the same disciplined technique that had become automatic through years of practice. This time, she didn't need to wait for Thompson's announcement to know the result. The shot felt perfect from the moment the trigger broke, and she could see through the scope that the bullet had found its mark exactly where she had intended. 5th shot, 10 points, Thompson announced, his voice carrying a note of amazement. Perfect score. 50 out of 50 possible points. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. People surged forward to congratulate Sarah and examine the target that would serve as proof of her remarkable achievement. Even shooters who had initially supported Patterson's skepticism were now clearly impressed by what they had witnessed. Sarah stood up slowly, setting her rifle down safely and removing her hearing protection. She felt a mixture of satisfaction and relief, but also a strange sense of anticlimax. The demonstration had accomplished what she intended, but it had also exposed her to a level of attention that made her uncomfortable. Patterson and his friends stood apart from the celebrating crowd, their expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to obvious embarrassment. They had publicly challenged someone they believed to be a fraud, and instead had provided her with a platform to demonstrate abilities that exceeded even their most generous estimates. Thompson approached Sarah with the official score sheet and a genuine smile. "Ma'am, I've been running this range for 15 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. Would you mind if I asked where you learned to shoot?" Sarah accepted the score sheet and glanced around at the crowd of people waiting for her response. She realized that this was her opportunity to set the record straight, not just with Patterson's group but with the entire club membership. "I learned to shoot in the United States Navy," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the range. "I served for 8 years as a naval special warfare operator. During that time, I completed multiple deployments and engaged targets under conditions that made today's demonstration look easy." The crowd absorbed this information with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Several people stepped forward to introduce themselves as fellow veterans, sharing their own service experiences and expressing gratitude for her military contribution. Patterson finally approached, his earlier hostility replaced by obvious discomfort. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. I mean, your shooting is obviously legitimate. Nobody could fake what we just saw." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus simple damage control. "Mr. Patterson, you didn't just question my shooting ability. You accused me of stolen valor, suggested that my service record was fraudulent, and made personal attacks on my character. Those are serious allegations that go well beyond concerns about marksmanship." Henderson and Walsh flanked Patterson, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were receiving from the crowd. Several club members were giving them hostile looks, apparently displeased with how they had treated someone who had just demonstrated exceptional skill. "We may have gotten a little carried away," Walsh admitted reluctantly. "But, you have to understand, we see a lot of people come through here making claims about their military service that don't check out." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand skepticism about service claims. But, there are respectful ways to verify someone's background without publicly humiliating them. What you did today crossed that line. She turned to address the larger crowd. I didn't serve my country for 8 years so that I could come home and be subjected to harassment and accusations from people who never took the time to get to know me or verify their suspicions through appropriate channels. The crowd murmured approval, and several veterans in attendance nodded their agreement with Sarah's statement. It was clear that the sentiment of the group had shifted decisively in her favor, and that Patterson's tactics had backfired spectacularly. In the days that followed the shooting demonstration, word of Sarah's remarkable performance spread throughout the local community and beyond. Several people had recorded videos of the event, and they quickly found their way onto social media platforms where they attracted thousands of views and comments. The story of the Navy SEAL veteran who had silenced her doubters with 5 perfect shots resonated with people far beyond the shooting sports community. Sarah found herself somewhat uncomfortable with the sudden attention. She had never sought publicity or recognition for her military service, preferring to process her experiences privately and transition to civilian life without fanfare. However, she also realized that the incident had created an opportunity to address some important issues about how veterans, particularly women veterans, were sometimes treated when they returned home. The shooting club's atmosphere had changed dramatically since the demonstration. Patterson, Henderson, and Walsh had become pariahs among the membership, with many people expressing disgust at how they had treated Sarah before bothering to learn anything about her background. Several members approached the club's board of directors to complain about the harassment and suggest policy changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Bill Thompson, the range officer who had supervised the shooting demonstration, took it upon himself to research Sarah's military record through official channels. What he discovered impressed even him. Her service record included multiple commendations, specialized training certifications, and deployment records that confirmed not just her status as a naval special warfare operator, but her exceptional performance in that role. I've seen a lot of military records over the years, Thompson told the club's president during a board meeting. This woman is the real deal, and what happened to her here was completely unacceptable. We need to make sure something like this never happens again. The board agreed, implementing new policies that established clear procedures for addressing disputes between members and zero tolerance for harassment based on gender, military service, or other personal characteristics. They also created a formal process for verifying military service claims when necessary, removing the need for confrontational challenges like the one Sarah had faced. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with the personal aftermath of the incident. The demonstration had been emotionally exhausting, bringing back memories of having to constantly prove herself during her military career. She found herself replaying the events, wondering if she could have handled the situation differently or avoided the confrontation altogether. Her VA counselor, Dr. Jennifer Stevens, helped her process these feelings during their regular sessions. You were put in an impossible situation, Stevens explained. Those men had already decided you were lying about your service, and nothing you could have said would have changed their minds. Sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to demonstrate that their assumptions are wrong. Sarah nodded, though she still felt conflicted about the attention the incident had generated. I just wanted to shoot in peace and work through my own issues. I never intended to become some kind of symbol or representative for women veterans. But maybe that's exactly what was needed, Stevens replied. How many other women veterans have faced similar challenges but didn't have your particular skills to respond with? Your experience might help change attitudes and prevent other people from going through what you endured. This perspective helped Sarah reframe the incident in a more positive light. She began to see the demonstration not just as a personal vindication, but as an opportunity to educate people about the capabilities and contributions of women in military service. She started accepting invitations to speak at veterans organizations and community groups about her experiences. Her first speaking engagement was at the local VFW post, where she addressed an audience of mostly male veterans from various conflicts and time periods. She spoke candidly about the challenges of being a woman in naval special warfare, the physical and mental demands of the training, and the bonds formed with teammates who initially doubted her abilities but eventually came to trust her with their lives. The men who question my service at the shooting club aren't necessarily bad people, she told the VFW audience. But, they were operating from assumptions and stereotypes rather than facts. Military service takes many forms, and we need to be careful about making judgments based on appearance or preconceived notions about who can and can't serve effectively. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Many veterans approached her after the speech to share their own experiences with assumptions and stereotypes, both during their service and after returning to civilian life. Several women veterans thanked her for speaking out about issues they had faced but felt unable to address themselves. Back at the shooting club, Patterson and his friends were dealing with the consequences of their actions. Several members had stopped associating with them, and their influence within the club's social hierarchy had been severely damaged. Patterson, in particular, seemed to understand that he had made a serious error in judgment. He approached Sarah during one of her visits to the range, clearly uncomfortable but determined to make his attempt at reconciliation. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "What I did was wrong, and I've been thinking about it a lot since the demonstration." Sarah looked up from her equipment preparation, studying his face for signs of sincerity. "I'm listening." "I served in the Army for 6 years," Patterson continued, "and I'm proud of that service. But I never saw combat, never faced the kind of challenges you obviously dealt with. I think maybe I was trying to make myself seem more important by diminishing other people's accomplishments." This admission surprised Sarah. She had expected either a defensive justification or a superficial apology designed to restore his social standing at the club. Instead, Patterson seemed to be engaging in genuine self-reflection about his behavior and motivations. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said carefully. "But your apology needs to address more than just my military service. You made personal attacks on my character and integrity. That goes beyond questioning someone's qualifications." Patterson nodded. "You're absolutely right. I was out of line in every possible way. I let my own insecurities turn into hostility towards someone who had never done anything to deserve it. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, and I'm sorry for creating a hostile environment that probably made other people uncomfortable too." Sarah considered his words carefully. She had no obligation to accept his apology or make his social rehabilitation easier. At the same time, she recognized that holding on to anger would ultimately be more harmful to her than to him. "I accept your apology," she said finally. "But I hope you understand that trust has to be rebuilt through actions, not just words. The atmosphere you and your friends created here was toxic for anyone who didn't fit your narrow definition of what a veteran should look like." "I understand that," Patterson replied. "And I want you to know that I've been talking to other people about their own experiences. I'm learning that I had a pretty limited view of military service and the different ways people contribute." Over the following months, Sarah watched as Patterson made genuine efforts to change his behavior and attitudes. He began reaching out to other club members he had previously dismissed or ignored, learning about their backgrounds and experiences. He also became an advocate for the new club policies designed to prevent harassment and discrimination. Henderson and Walsh were slower to acknowledge their mistakes, but even they eventually came to terms with what had happened. Henderson, in particular, seemed genuinely surprised to learn about the extent and diversity of women's military service throughout history. He began reading books and articles about female combat veterans, developing a better understanding of the challenges they faced both during and after their service. Sarah's shooting performance, meanwhile, continued to attract attention from the competitive shooting community. She received invitations to participate in regional and national competitions, opportunities that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. While she was initially reluctant to commit to a formal competitive schedule, she eventually decided that excellence in the sport could be another way to honor her military training and challenge stereotypes about women's capabilities. Her first major competition was a 3-day precision rifle event in Colorado Springs, featuring some of the best marksmen in the country. The field included active-duty military snipers, law enforcement officers, and civilian competitors with decades of experience. Sarah was one of only a handful of women participating, and the only one in her age category. The competition format included multiple stages with different challenges, long-range precision shots, rapid-fire sequences, and complex scenarios designed to test both technical skill and decision-making under pressure. Sarah approached each stage with the same methodical preparation she had learned during her military service, focusing on fundamentals rather than allowing herself to be intimidated by the reputation of her competitors. By the end of the first day, she was ranked in the top 10 overall, ahead of many shooters with more competition experience and expensive custom equipment. Her consistency across different types of challenges impressed even the competitors who had initially been skeptical about her abilities. "I've been watching her technique," commented retired Army sniper Jake Morrison during a break between stages. "She's not just talented, she's been trained by professionals. Every shot follows the same sequence, the same fundamentals. That's not something you pick up at a civilian shooting school." Word of Sarah's performance spread quickly through the competition community, much as it had at the shooting club months earlier. However, the atmosphere at the competition was entirely different. These were serious marksmen who valued skill above all other considerations, and they recognized genuine ability when they saw it. On the final day of competition, Sarah faced the most challenging stage, a series of long-range shots at small targets under varying wind conditions. The scenario was designed to simulate real-world tactical shooting situations, requiring competitors to make quick decisions about range estimation, wind compensation, and target priority. Sarah drew on every aspect of her military training as she worked through the course. The targets and distances were similar to scenarios she had faced during actual deployments, and the pressure of competition was nothing compared to the stakes she had dealt with in combat situations. When the final scores were tabulated, Sarah had finished in second place overall, ahead of dozens of accomplished shooters with years of competitive experience. Her performance earned her recognition from the shooting sports media and invitations to join several professional shooting teams. More importantly, her success sent a clear message about the capabilities of women veterans and the value of military training in competitive shooting sports. Several young women approached her after the awards ceremony, expressing interest in both military service and competitive shooting as potential career paths. "You've shown us that it's possible," said Maria Gonzalez, a college student who had been following Sarah's competition results. "I'm planning to enlist in the Marines next year, and seeing what you've accomplished gives me confidence that I can succeed too." These interactions reinforced Sarah's growing sense that her visibility in the shooting sports community served a purpose beyond personal achievement. She was providing representation for women veterans and female shooters who had previously lacked prominent role models in these traditionally male-dominated fields. As months turned into years, Sarah's story continued to resonate with people far beyond the shooting sports community. She was featured in articles about women's military service, invited to speak at colleges and universities about leadership and perseverance, and consulted by organizations working to improve support services for veterans. The shooting club where her journey had begun also evolved significantly. The new policies implemented after the incident with Patterson became a model that other clubs across the state adopted. The membership grew more diverse, with increasing numbers of women and younger shooters joining and feeling welcome in the environment. Patterson himself became an unlikely ally in these efforts. His experience with Sarah had prompted a fundamental re-evaluation of his attitudes and assumptions, leading him to become an advocate for inclusion and respectful treatment of all club members regardless of their background or appearance. "I learned more about myself from that incident than I had in years," he reflected during a club meeting where Sarah was being honored for her competitive achievements. "It showed me how easy it is to let prejudices and insecurities turn you into someone you don't want to be. Sarah gave me an opportunity to grow as a person, even though I certainly didn't deserve it at the time." Sarah's response to his comments reflected the wisdom she had gained from her military service and her journey as a veteran. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. The important thing is that we create environments where people feel safe to be themselves and pursue their interests without having to constantly prove their worth to others. The 5 perfect shots that had silenced Sarah's critics that day at the shooting club had achieved something far beyond demonstrating her marksmanship skills. They had initiated conversations about respect, inclusion, and the diverse faces of military service that continued to influence people years later. For Sarah herself, the incident had marked a turning point in her transition to civilian life. Instead of trying to remain invisible and avoid attention, she had learned to embrace her role as a representative for women veterans and use her platform to create positive change. As she continued to compete, speak, and mentor other veterans, Sarah often reflected on how a moment of confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for education and growth. The men who had mocked her service had inadvertently provided her with a chance to demonstrate not just her shooting ability, but her character, resilience, and commitment to serving others even after her formal military service had ended. The target from that day's demonstration still hung in her home office, a reminder of the power of preparation, professionalism, and quiet confidence in the face of doubt and hostility. More importantly, it represented her ongoing commitment to proving that service members come in all forms, and that the values learned in military service, honor, courage, and commitment, continue to guide veterans long after they return home. In the end, those 5 perfect shots had done more than silence her critics. They had given voice to countless other veterans who had faced similar challenges, created opportunities for dialogue and understanding, and established Sarah as a role model for anyone who had ever been underestimated because of their appearance or background.